Hello. So I'd like to discuss Genesis chapter 1, which is actually 1 1 through 2 3, but we'll just call it chapter 1. It's some things that you don't usually hear about in the Christian world, like in sermons, teachings, these kinds of things. Some literary devices that are used, and some other topics regarding Genesis 1 I'd like to bring out to kind of add to understanding of this portion of Scripture because it is part of Scripture. And so if it's not being discussed, that raises questions in my mind as to why. So I'm going to mention a few things here as an introduction, and then we'll probably only go over one or two of these, and then I'll cover the rest of them at another time. So Genesis 1 is so much more than what we give it credit for if we don't understand the Hebrew, if we don't understand the definitions, if we don't understand these literary forms and devices that are used. The first thing that it is a description. So it is a narrative, a description of how God brings a solution to a problem. And that's not usually how it's framed. It's usually framed as like God ex nihilo, out of nothing, creating the world through speech. And it could be that, but if you read it, in the beginning of God's creating the heaven and earth, the world was without form and void. And that's a little bit more of an accurate translation than in the beginning, comma, God did such and such. So if you look at it grammatically, it's not saying in the beginning, this is what God did. It's at the beginning of the thing that God is doing. So it's more like in the beginning of God's creation of the heaven and earth, but it doesn't really sound exactly right in English to say it that way. But that's closer to what it is. So it's this problem of this tohu vavohu, formless and void, wild and waste, welter and waste. There are different translations for that, but it's basically saying it's wild, it's untamed, it's chaotic, and it's void of life, and then it's dark as well. So these three things: formless, void, and dark. And then it's God bringing order, bringing life, and bringing light into this world. He's ordering that which is already there. And it's not to say that God didn't create the world, but Genesis 1 doesn't cover that. It's already there. The waters are already there, with the earth presumably underneath it, and the spirit hovering above the waters. So that's the first thing. Then you have these structures called chiasms or chiasmus, um, and it's basically this literary structure, what you might call poetic, where it starts with a word or phrase, and then as it progresses, there's something in the middle that's being highlighted, and then it's kind of reversing the pattern of those words and phrases. And I'll give some examples of that. But that's all throughout the Bible, and especially in Genesis, we see it like at different levels. So like the entire chapter, and then like certain passages have this structure. So we'll look at that, and then the order of how God does this. He first divides and orders, and then he fills. So he's creating these environments on days 1, 2, and 3. And then on 4, 5, and 6, he's filling those. So you actually have like blocks of 1, 2, 3, and then 4, 5, 6, creating the environments, and then he's filling those environments in the same order with creatures or inhabitants, so to speak. And then you have sevens. So the number 7 obviously is repeated throughout the Bible. Obviously, there are 7 days of creation, including the Sabbath, the day of rest. But the number 7 is replete throughout Genesis 1. We'll look at that. And then Genesis 1 is actually polemic. And I've never heard this. So I actually co-led a study about Genesis 1 with somebody else, and we talked about it quite a bit, and we were kind of on the same page. And he had actually gone through the Bible Project's class about Genesis and another class as well, and it discussed these things. So Genesis 1 is kind of a polemic against the creation myths of the surrounding cultures, Mesopotamia and Egypt particularly. And we'll look at that. And then we'll look at Genesis 1 as kind of a meditative text, something that you can dwell on and gain practical insight about the world. And then we'll look at these kind of definitions or even the primordial archetype of heaven, water, land, light, all these things. So, first thing I'd like to cover is actually the sevens. And I'd like to do kind of a visual representation of these, particularly the sevens and the order and the chiasms and how they layer on top of each other. I think that would be really cool. And that's kind of why I've delayed doing this for so long, is because I didn't know what format really would be best for all this. And I'd like to do some kind of infographic or some, I'm sure it exists somewhere, but I've never seen anything where it overlays all of these different literary structures. It's Genesis 1 is really quite amazing, just as a literary feat. Okay, so I've brought up the Hebrew and English text here. And then, so I'm just going to go through these pretty quickly. But so Genesis 1:1 is 7 Hebrew words altogether, and it goes from right to left. So it's Bereshit, etc. Bereshit being in the beginning. And so there's seven Hebrew words, and those are composed of 28 Hebrew letters, so 7 times 4. Um, Genesis 2 is 14 Hebrew words, so that's 7 times 2. Obviously, we have the 7 days of creation, including the Sabbath, and there are the conclusion. This is the 7th paragraph of Genesis 1 through 2, 3. Has 3 lines. Starts with 3 lines of 7 words each. And Genesis 2, 1 through 3, so the ending part is 35, 7 times 5 words altogether. The word God appears 35 times, 7 times 5. The word earth appears 21 times, 7 times 3, and heaven, its counterpart, appears 21 times as well. The announcement, and God said, while occurring 10 times, occurs in 7 groups, which I'll show you here. So here's my notes. So you have these 7 groupings, and then you have let there be, while occurring 8 times, is grouped into 7. The formula, and it was so God did such and such, and it was so, occurs 7 times. The formula, and God made, occurs 7 times. God saw that it was good, occurs 7 times. And the subsequent divine word or blessing occurs 7 times. So all of these sevens, and they're kind of overlaying each other in a sense. So I wanted to throw in here that it might seem like, okay, well, there's 7 days of creation, so all of these phrases are just occurring once for each day of creation, so what's the big deal? Well, actually, some of these, so like, and it was good, like some of them are missing from certain days and they're doubled up on other days. So it's very intentional. It wasn't just like, oh, here's a format, God said this happened, and it was good. And that happened 7 times. It's actually a little bit more complicated than that. Anyway, I wanted to throw that in there. Really points to the intentionality of Genesis 1 as a, some people call it exalted prose. I mean, I would call it poetry with all of these different layers that we'll see on top of these sevens. I don't know how else to describe it other than, maybe poetic narrative or, as you saw in my notes there, literary flourishes. It's created beautifully, right? So this should factor into our understanding of what Genesis 1 is. And just the fact that this is not discussed in your average Sunday sermon about Genesis 1, it's kind of suspect. It's like, why? I think there's a hesitancy to discuss these things when you're coming from a evangelical fundamentalist creationist perspective of like, no, we need it to be just a description of the creation. If it's too poetic, then people will question whether or not that is the most appropriate way to read that. And maybe it should, but regardless, this is an aspect of Scripture. So why should we ignore it? Obviously, we shouldn't. Everything is intentional here. It was meant to be understood this way in its Hebrew context by its original Hebrew author and audience, presumably. It's like they would have been looking for these things and noticed them. So that is, and there may be others, there may be other occurrences of seven things. That's one aspect to Genesis 1, and then we'll look at the chiasms and the other structures a little bit later, but I'm going to go ahead and start with that. I'll see you next time.